So now we have a second distinguished panel here of speakers in which we want to reflect, on the one hand side, a bit more forward-looking, and on the other hand side, less institutionally, reflecting on CEPR, but more on Europe. I'm very happy to have André, Hélène, José, Leandro joining us from the Commission, Paola, Conconi, and Micael from ECARES to discuss about challenges for Europe. But if we start with Europe, maybe my first question is, can you tell us how Europe was important for you in your own development, in your research career? Tell us a positive story about Europe. I have just come from a full day of meetings in Berlin, a small summit of policymakers and business people that is organized every year, like a kind of mini Davos for Germany. And one of the CEOs would ask every policymaker who came into the room, and these are really cabinet level people, what is your vision for Europe? And I thought that was actually quite a good question. That is a kind of question. We want positive stories. We ask for leadership. Give me your vision for Europe. Now I'm going not to ask this very difficult question, but give me a good story, a personal story on Europe to start with. Micael, why don't you start from that side?
So. Not only for me, but I think even if we're not aware of that, all academics have hugely benefited from Europe. Shaz mentioned it in the first panel, but if you remember 25 years ago what a university was in Europe, it was a very local institution with the local people. You would study there, become a professor there, take your retirement there, and you had these different cells not really interacting. You had the French way of doing political science, the French way of doing economics, the Belgian way, the German way, etc. And as a student, so you've seen that among the heroes, many of them are from the University of Brussels. I studied in Brussels, and I was very lucky to have CEPR coming to us. We had these different lunchtime tables, and immediately I got dived into this multiculturalism that Europe provides. See what is being done outside your own institution, cross-check ideas, and I think Europe is a fantastic laboratory for that. It's a place where people come from different institutional backgrounds, they face different problems, and you need to think in a bigger way immediately. And I think that's a fantastic contribution of Europe. And indeed, now it seems so natural. People go on Erasmus in their studies, you travel all the time, and we should remember how it was 25 years ago. It was very more fragmented and different.
Erasmus was indeed we were probably together the first generation who took for granted a bit Europe and mobility in Europe. As I started university in Italy in the early 90s, and I think Erasmus was founded or launched in 87. And so we all could go, we could start going. I went to the UK, and I basically never went back to Italy. I then went to the US and to the UK for my graduate studies, but I never went back to live and work. So I think this is something that from my generation onwards, we took it for granted, but this mobility in Europe, which then made us go elsewhere in the world, but I think it's something great. More specifically for research, CEPR, since we're celebrating CEPR, I mentioned earlier we had an interview about the role the CEPR had in our careers, they asked us, and I think CEPR had a key role at the early stages of my career. It was said earlier how great CEPR can be. I mean, it gives you visibility. One of my first presentations was in front of Jean Grossman and Hélène and Hellman, and it was quite daunting because these were the godfathers, and they had written seminal works that I've been reading and studying, and and they were there in my audience, and they gave me feedback, and this gives you exposure, visibility, confidence. It's really key, particularly at the early stage of the career. So not only Europe and mobility in Europe was key for as a student and later as a researcher, but also CEPR in Europe was really important as a network for my career.
Thank you. You want a personal story, right? Okay. I'm going to give you one. I'm a very improbable European. I was born in Angola, where my parents were born. My grandparents on my mother's side were also born in Angola. And so I lived all my childhood in Africa. And we left Angola in 1975 with the Civil War and came to Europe as refugees. We had nothing. We arrived in Portugal. It was a country emerging from a revolution in deep economic, social, political crisis. But it was amazing how this country, in such a situation, was able to absorb about 1 million people who arrived in the middle of a crisis. And it's an example of how this can be done. And I will always be grateful to how Portugal welcomed us, because it was a foreign country. I mean, we spoke the same language, but I had never been there. So anyway, then I got a scholarship and went to study at the College of Europe in Bruges, here in Belgium. And that changed my life. Because then I discovered what my vocation was Europe. And I knew what I wanted to do the rest of my life, which was to work for this project. And having experienced civil turmoil, I know what peace and freedom mean. And so for me, this is a very personal values, which most people, including my children now, take for granted, but which we should not forget that not long ago it was a space where this freedom and peace was not so common, and we should not take this for granted. So that's my story.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I think I can consider myself largely a European product, because I actually did my PhD at LSE using a Marie Curie fellowship. I started to work in economics being very, very interested on the theory of optimum currency areas and more generally international currencies, because I was fascinated by the idea of Europe and European Monetary Union. And largely my work on international currencies was about understanding the role of the dollar and as a kind of mirror effect, whether the euro could play such a similar role also in the future. And Charlie, who is here, was my advisor and probably remember these issues about the theory of optimum currency areas and all the difficulties from a theoretical point of view and how you take into account zillions of aspects which are not in any of our models, etc. And then it doesn't end there, because after that, and now I'm still benefiting from the European Research Council grants, which are a great help for researchers in Europe. And also, of course, CEPR has also had a tremendous benefit as a European network on my research early on, for exactly the reason that were mentioned here, in terms of getting visibility very early on, having tremendous feedback in conferences and so on. So I can say that Europe for me has had a tremendous impact. So I'm not sure if you like the end product, but I think I'm pretty much a European product.
So my story about Europe is both professional and personal. On the personal side, both my parents were immigrants into Belgium. My father came from Lithuania, which was then Poland when he came. So when I was born, actually, I was a Polish citizen, born here in Brussels. My mother comes from a small town, which is now in Ukraine, which was Russia when she was born, and then was Romanian when she came to Belgium. and with a name not so unlike Moscovici. My mother was called Simonovici, and so those are Jewish names. Simonovic, that's really what it is, like Moscovic, in fact, but that's the way the Romanian wrote it. So obviously Europe, the project of Europe and the peace project has been very, very important, crucial to our lives. Professionally, after I graduated here in Brussels with my master's, I went to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore to do my PhD. I did my PhD with Bella Balassa, and he sort of inspired me into the kind of economist I wanted to be. Balassa was an academic economist, but he was also an economic advisor at the World Bank. He was 2 days a week at Hopkins and 3 days a week, or he was really working 7 days a week at the bank. And that's sort of the kind of model I wanted to be, especially after I came back to Belgium. I spent 10 years in America, came back. By that time I was married. My wife is Indian, so very international background. Came back to Europe. I was interested in policy. I was not interested in Belgian politics at all. And to be involved in policy in Belgium, you have to be involved in politics. And I just wasn't interested in Belgian politics or the different clans. And Europe offered me that opportunity to get involved in policy, but without having to, to say I'm belonging to this or to this kind. I was belonging, in a sense, to the European party, not to one of the ideological parties. And that was a great period for me to work in the Commission. I worked in the end. I mean, I started to work for 3 years. Somebody mentioned Michael Emerson. Right? Worked with Michael Emerson. I started to work in 1990. And that was just, in the single market and then before the euro. And many of the people who are in this room, I worked with in those years. So first, I was meant to work for 3 years as economic advisor. Those were posts for academic, typically, to come and work for 3 years. But the match went well, and I stayed longer. And I worked with the Director General in ECFIN for many years with Giovanni Ravasio. Was really a great guy, and I learned a huge amount from him. And one anecdote on this, I don't want to be too long. Giovanni Ravasio was also a graduate from our university. I did not know him, obviously he was much older, but when I started to work for him in 1990, he had just become the Director General. I met him, I was one of his economic advisors. We hit very well, because we had the same professor and with the same background, immigrant, both of us, so we had a lot of things in common. But what I thought about him at first when I met him is that his economics was a bit rusty. And I remember mentioning to him, various well-known academic economists. Didn't ring a bell to him at all. And I thought, gosh, what am I doing here? I'm going to work for somebody who's, really disconnected from where economics is at the moment. By that time, I was already a full professor. I was 40 in 1990. And I started to wonder, did I make the right choice to come and work here for 3 years? And then, little by little, I realized that each time Giovanni was asking me something, basically, something that Delors would ask him, on this and this issue, and he would ask me, tell me, André, what is it you think, or can you write me a note? I realized that I never had the answer. That each time he asked me a question, I needed a week to reflect on this issue. And, I started to think that, economics is maybe harder than I had imagined and maybe more interesting. So I really learned a lot from him, and, it's been great experiences for me.
Thank you very much to all of you for sharing that, and I think it is actually very visible that in our generation there are lots of positive stories on Europe too. Certainly, there was a generation of great Europeans who deeply, deeply believed that Europe was the solution, And we do, and if I can also add my own, for those of you who know me, most of you, to many of you, they think that I am German because that's the way I usually am invited as the German on the podium, but I'm actually not. I'm Swiss, and I was raised in Guatemala, but at the end of the day, I am really deeply European too in feeling, and I can actually explain to the Germans why they may not be right, and I can also go to Italy, which is another nationality I have, and play the German successfully there. So in that sense, I guess I'm also quite a product of Europe. But that brings me to the challenges that we are facing today of Europe. So my second, let's turn it around and give me your biggest challenge. And if I can add to that question, also right away the second one, which is we are not lacking in ideas on how to solve the present problems, but rather I would at least venture saying how to get there. If you're thinking about, concretely, for instance, the euro area, the number of probability that somebody comes up with a totally new proposal is rather small, I would say, because there are so many out there. But most of them have somehow also been killed. There is so the question is, how to get there, and. So what are the biggest challenges? And if you agree that maybe the biggest challenge is how to get there, how do we deal with that? This way around. Now from here.
Okay. Now, I actually don't think that the biggest problem is something related to the euro or to some of the technical side, what we would call technical side, the banking union, all of those elements. I really think that, and issues on which I'm working also. I think the biggest challenge now for Europe and for us as economists is to reconnect with the concerns of citizens. And I think Matthias, addressed some of those issues in his intervention. I think that, you cannot talk to, for citizens, the euro has to work. What's happening in the kitchen, that's not their problem. Obviously, if the euro works badly, or there is a crisis, or if it's in the newspapers, obviously they start to get worried, and I get phone calls like all of us, right? You get phone calls, should I take my money out, right? From this bank, should I put my money in another currency, right? We probably, all of us got phone calls from some family members or some from friends. But they don't care to know, the banking union, the resolution of this. What do they care, right? That should be work. It's just like when you go into a car, right? I don't know how the car works actually, right? What I care is to put the key in the engine and this thing starts and it rides well, gives me a good ride, and I'm happy with my car. What's behind it, I don't care. So, what is it that citizens care about? I personally think that we, as an economic profession, we are not paying sufficient attention to that. And, we were talking in the previous panel, and I've been doing a lot of that myself, talking to policymakers, to decision makers. But that's a little bit the elite talking to the elite. I think we have to also be a bit more attuned, in Europe in particular, about concerns of citizens. Now, is that about income distribution? Is it about green economy? One can discuss those. But those are things that talk to citizens. There are some issues on migration, obviously. But I think we really need to make that effort to not only talk to people of the elite, because otherwise I think Europe, when I think as we have at the moment sort of a populist wave, the first victim of that is going to be Europe. Europe is viewed as an elite project. Now you can say, well, this project of Europe, we would have never achieved what we have achieved without it being an elite project to start with. But where we are today, in 2019, we have to really, I think, reconnect the project.
Okay, that's a difficult question, obviously. I'm going to echo a little bit what André said by saying, in a way, we are at the point where we are almost talking about survival of a European Union. I think it's maybe as serious as that. To some extent, I mean, as economists, we're focused a lot on economic issues, which tend to be a bit technical, and we certainly have to focus on those issues. However, we see that in the public at large, and maybe among economists as well, we have forgotten a little bit the founding values of Europe and what Europe has been made from, where it comes from. That's what José was mentioning in terms of the values of, peace, unity, Europe as a geopolitical entity as well, in a world which is not necessarily very friendly, and certainly is not very friendly now. And what we are seeing is that, I think, largely citizens of Europe have forgotten about what Europe was for. Certainly in the Brexit debate, I think that has been an extraordinary discovery for me to realize that most people had actually very little idea about not only how Europe really worked, but also what Europe was for and how it had been created. And nobody knew, or very few people knew. So that's a gigantic problem, and now we are facing a wall. We are facing, definitely those. I won't, mention all these problems with populist governments that we have everywhere, but we have them inside the EU, and definitely these values are being attacked both from outside the EU and from inside the EU, and this is the time to actually all come together to do something about that. I think that's where we are. That's a pretty stark, maybe, message, but that's where we are. Now, obviously, there's also a lot of economic issues that have to be dealt with, and CEPR has done a number of very nice reports and I think very important work there. Some of it was mentioned by Beatrice. How do we move forward on a certain number of these issues, whether it is the euro area governance reform or whether it is things that we should be doing a lot more about, like the environment, pollution, the climate change, all these issues about carbon prices, but also Europe of defense, etc. I think to move forward, we have to go into coalitions, into smaller clubs than the EU is used to operating, and André and Jean have been writing about that, but I think that's one possibility to move forward a little bit quicker than has usually been the case within the EU, now that we have so many countries with so many different priorities. So as a modus operandi, that would be the way I would look at it. But in terms of what the big issue is, I think it is the issue of survival and regaining trust of citizens. And to regain trust of citizens, one has to do take very meaningful positions. This could, from an economic point of view, we can talk more about issues about corruption, about issues about institutions, attack of liberties, all these very important things. Fiscal evasion, obviously, is also a very important issue. Fairness should be at the top of the agenda. Money laundering, as Richard mentioned earlier. All these issues, it seems to me Europe could be doing a lot more, right? And there's little excuse not to do a lot more. And I think that would help with largely to regain trust of the citizens.
Thank you. I think over the last 10 years and after the crisis, there has been clearly an erosion of trust in Europe from the people on Europe, and Europe is seen now as an agent of globalization and an agent of austerity. It has been a victim of the way the crisis was managed or badly managed. So now we're in a point where Europe needs to reconnect with people. And to do that, I think we need to address four main challenges. One is inequality and unemployment. I think this is a paramount issue. Unemployment is coming down and all this, and unemployment rate is below what it was before the crisis, but there's still a lot of people, 17 million people in Europe unemployed, and a lot of young people, 35% of the young population in some member states. So there's a big issue there. Second issue is migration. I think clearly we need to find a solution, a European solution to this issue that people are concerned about. And if we don't address it, it will get out of hand in terms of feeding populism and extremist views. The third one, I think, is the environmental challenges and the energy transition that needs to be addressed. And the final one is security and defense. And I think these are the areas, you can look at variations of these four areas, that should be the basis for the agenda of the next commission coming in by the end of this year. Now, how do you approach these four areas? There are a number of priorities. One of them is definitely to complete the monetary union and the architecture, make sure that this project serves the people, because what is going on is that people like the euro, but they think the governance of the euro, they don't like it, and they think that it's not serving them. So if you ask people, the euro has never been so popular. 74% of the people say that the euro is a good thing for the EU as a whole. 64% of the people say that the euro is a good thing for their own country. It's one of the highest support levels we've seen in the history of the euro. And interestingly enough, the countries where this support has gone up one of them is Italy, the biggest increase in support over the last year. You have Portugal, Spain, Ireland. Cyprus is an outlier where support has gone down. But so even the countries where the crisis hit the most, people like the euro. Now, what they don't like, as I said, is the governance of the euro. So they like the stability and the strength of the currency. They don't want to go back to the years of high inflation and all this. But they don't like the governance. So we need to make this distinction. And we need to focus on how to complete and improve the governance. So that's the first thing. The second one is the single market, I think, which there is a huge potential there that is not being tapped. Then defense, as I said, I think there is a huge potential to do more at the European level in defense. Taxation, big issue, linked to the first point, inequality. Europe has to become a champion of the fight against tax evasion, tax fraud, and this means that probably we need to change the way.
Champion of tax evasion.
Exactly. Some of our member states are champions. So this is another issue, which is a very difficult one because it touches into the sovereignty of the member states. And then there is the issue of innovation policy and a 21st century industrial policy, if you want to call it like that. I don't like this term because it has connotations, but a modern innovation policy, because otherwise China and US are going to drive us out of business. And acting in these areas means that in some of these points, we need to redefine the distribution of powers between the national level and the European level. This is not going to be easy. You take migration, you take defense, and in some areas in the monetary union, you need to redefine. We need to go into a more flexible way of working. where you probably have to accept that some member states are ready to go further than others. We don't have to go all at the same pace. This applies in many areas. In the EMU, probably it's more difficult to apply because you cannot have a monetary policy for some in the euro area and for others, or a deposit insurance only for some member states of the euro area. But in areas outside the EMU, in the EMU architecture, we should be ready, and that's my personal view, we should be ready to accept a much more flexible. So that's how I would chart very quickly the agenda for the next 4 or 5 years.
So the biggest challenges, I don't know, I think there are many, but I'm going to mention 2. One is linked to André's original comment about lack of trust. I would say actually neither of the 2 challenges are new. The EU has been long accused of suffering from a democratic deficit. This has always been the case. I was looking at some of the statistics about turnout. Since the first European election in 1979, turnout in European election has been falling steadily. In the last elections, in 2014, turnout in European election was 42 point something, as compared on average across member states, as compared to 68% in national elections. So citizens don't trust, but also don't participate in European elections, don't know much about it, and so this is a major problem. I think partly linked to a lack of transparency and accountability of EU institutions. So more could be done, I think, in making institutions like the councils or, the parliament has become more influential and more transparent, and there are now roll call votes. But for example, in the council, very important votes are not public, and this is not very democratic. And so there are ways in which European institutions, the Commission, the Council, the Parliament, maybe to a lesser extent, could be made more transparent, more accountable, and hopefully this would improve its legitimacy, and people would be more involved. The second major problem, again, is not new, and that is this tension. So Hélène was saying we should remember the values. I think there's, however, a problem, a tension between the values. So the project is there's always been this tension between this deeper project. In the Treaty of Rome, they were calling it, in the Treaty of Rome, they were saying ever closer union among member states. So this very federalist project, which has been, going from just being a customs union to being much more with the single market and the Eurozone, and on the other hand, going from 6 to 28, and with the Western Balkans being in the front, so going larger and much more heterogeneous. So I think part of the problem is not just the values, but which way do you go, and how do you reform the governance to make these projects still, So there are various proposals. I was rereading some of the work that André has done, for example, with Jean-Pierre Zaniferi, proposing what you call a core EU plus clubs that go ahead with some of the policy issues that are key and where there's heterogeneity is very pronounced. So the problem with that, there've been, as much as I think more flexibility is needed, it's not that easy, and some of the proposals have been heavily criticized, and I don't think they are now on the table. And so one of the problems that I saw rereading your proposal of these, multi-speed, multi-geometry, Europe, is that these clubs will suffer from free riding. If you have a group that goes ahead and does defense, migration, cooperate on some of these policies where there are positive spillovers for non-members, because you mentioned this will make these clubs more efficient internally and externally. It's not clear to me that working as a subset of countries on some key issues like taxation, migration, it's actually efficient. You probably want everyone involved. So this is from an economics point of view, but also politically, some people I was reading have been criticizing this multi-speed, multi-geometry, saying, well, but you are losing the cloud, the political cloud. Europe is now a big player. You're going to go back to your clubs, and this is not something you want. So I think this is a big question. How do you reconcile this going deeper and be more efficient and coordinate better on key policies with this widening of the European Union?
Just to put one thing in perspective about turnout rate, midterm elections in the US 2014.
Oh, yeah.
36.7%. So I don't think that on that side the democratic deficit is that big. I think these turnout rates are fairly normal for such a big area, 500 million. How many? 5 billion people across all Europe. For the rest, I would like to just take a slightly different angle at this issue of the biggest challenges for Europe. I agree basically with everything that has been said here. The only thing is, I think in a more systematic way, Europe should learn to think about demonstrating that it can do something positive. Too often we have been making fantastic, outlandish promises. We've been promising that with the single market we would have bigger, better companies, that we would become the leader in technology, that we would deliver growth, the euro would provide more access to everyone, and so on. And then what do you see in the end? You take a headline number, you take growth rates, you take unemployment rates, and the result is just not completely there. And systematically, the institutions are forced by the mechanism that they have. They are stuck, that they can't push their projects because you have too many checks and balances sometimes, veto rights, and so on. And then you're just there trying to defend something which is working so and so, as being the only policy that had to be made. That was the best solution still. And you keep having to defend that. And we've seen that on many occasions. I can think now about regional policy. You could see all these transfers, and then there were these debates in economic policy, among others. I remember a paper by Micael and others showing that actually the growth rates of these regions did not accelerate. And you tell that to people who work on regional policy, and they say, yeah, but you should think about the counterfactual. It could have been worse, yes, but you're not thinking about proving, like having when we do research, or empirical research it's not my strong point, but we can see how the methodology of research has progressed in the last decade. It's about diff in diff, it's about identification. You want to see, okay, you want to make a policy mistake, we think it's a policy mistake, do it. And we can then take the data and show that indeed if you've made that kind of mistake, it was costly for you. And sometimes mistakes, turn out to be the right solution. The Washington consensus of an outward growth policy is actually a policy mistake. The Asian countries, some Asian countries started to open themselves up, and that proved to be the right solution. So sometimes maybe we should produce experiments. There was a series of very good papers by Dewa-Tripon and Roland on how you can use experimentation and implement reforms progressively to produce information, and that information, when it's good, will trigger new reforms and new advances. So we should embed that in the European project. Europe, and again, that's what I benefited the most from as a young researcher, is very diverse. André Sapir has done this series of papers identifying the Scandinavian model versus the Mediterranean model, etc. It's a constant laboratory. We have different countries, different regions inside each country who want to implement their own things. And then, as Pierre-Olivier was saying before, or as Richard insisted on, we need then to have a central data hub where we can access these data, make them comparable, and make them accessible to everyone. If you just, every single experiment is like under a veil, something to hide policy mistakes, then we cannot make any progress. And Europe needs to be institutionalizing, I think, this experimentation method. With the crisis, the excuse that we could not move fast is that, yes, Europe is like one of these big boats, one of these big tankers. If you want to veer them right or left, you need a lot of time, and small countries are more agile. They can react faster. Yeah, but the point is we should develop this agility at the same time. I think that's one of the biggest challenges for the future. If we want to avoid the possibility of a systematic disconnect, I think we need to think constantly about having to prove ourselves.
Well, thank you very much for this, and I think I would like to open to the floor for any questions or comments that you may have from the audience, and then we will have a last round.
I think all of us here can share a lot of what you have said. We all are Europeans, have studied elsewhere, and when I was listening to the presentation of everybody, I was thinking, yes, this works really well for us. It's true, it's fantastic. But as all of you reminded, it's very difficult to sell the benefit of Europe at the individual level. And we have European election in May. So the question I have for you is, what would you say, all these voters of Brexit, all the yellow vest, that at the individual, what can we tell them at the individual level for them to vote in a more, perhaps more rational way than emotional, and make the European institution workable after the election?
I think for the yellow vest, there was a very good piece by Philippe de Feit, Belgian politician and economist, recently about consumption in Europe. How many cars have been owned by different households, how many mobile phones, how many this, how many that. And it's all grown like tremendously over the last 15 years. And among these 15 years, you have, 8, 9, which are crisis years. And again, I think we just lose memory of what it was before, because everything has been taken for granted. This mobility, this openness, this accessibility, the fact that you can cross borders. I mean, who remembers the difficulty it was? I can tell a small story. We had cousins who had wine in France, just at the border with Belgium, and we wanted to, bring back some wine into Belgium, and we're super scared. Because maybe we had one bottle too much, we could have been arrested for trafficking. All these things now are so normal that people don't realize what they would be losing if they were moving backward. And I think just showing them this kind of data, showing them what you can do thanks to the progress of Europe, and that these complaints that you can't go to the restaurant as often as others, yes, but look at 15 years ago, it's not true that you could do so many things so much better. And we forget that. You take the With World data produced by Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez and others. Europe is the continent with the lowest level of inequality on the planet. Why not tell people about that more?
I would say, I'm often confronted to this kind of situation, of talking to neighbors, about Europe, and people asking me in a negative manner, telling me, well, isn't Europe responsible for this, responsible for that? And I think we have to, obviously, there are lots of good things about Europe, and we have to put them forward. I think it's very hard for most people to think in, somebody said, Charles, you were saying, people cannot think in general equilibrium terms. That's clear. We have to understand that, right? People are not idiots because they cannot. We have been trained for years and years to think, maybe brainwashed to think into those terms. So we have to see that people, are not educated to think that way. That doesn't mean that they're idiots. Nor, I think, can they have counterfactuals. I think that doesn't help. It would have been much worse without the euro, this kind of response. Think of if there had not been the euro, how bad it would have been. And remember in 1992, nobody cares about that. Most people first were not there in 1992. So what do they? You are talking about it's like my grandfather telling me about the First World War. Okay, So that doesn't work. So I think we have also to put forward a number of positive elements, all these diversity issues, and I think traveling, I think people can connect to that. But I think we have to be willing also to engage into the fact that the project needs to be improved. So I think this is essential. In order to have a dialogue with most people, is to admit, and I think that's what probably all of us in this room believe, that the project needs to be improved. And but this is what I always tell people: be very, very careful about the choices that you're making in the election, because you can make the choices to improve Europe, or you can make the choices to have Europe fall apart. And when Europe will fall apart, then we will be back in the Europe that we have known various times in the 20th century, that everybody knows. You don't have to have been there to know about First World War, Second World War. Right? Not everybody has had to have my experience. You know, I didn't have any of my grandparents. All my grandparents, they were killed in the war. Okay, I know that. Okay, I don't wish that to anybody, but I know that. So one has to, you know, everybody knows that Europe has been a very bloody place for centuries. And the 20th century was a really bloody century. So that people can understand. That's not counterfactual. But at the same time, we should not, pretend that Europe does not have many, many problems. But let's talk and let's discuss and have a serious discussion about that. And listen to people, not sort of teach them, also listen to them.
One quick thing you said, and I agree, that the problem is people don't have counterfactual, so they don't think, oh, but what if, we could undo everything. But Brexit, I was thinking, could be a bit of a counterfactual in the sense that we'll see what happens, but in a way, that would be really an experiment of undoing European integration and the implications for all sorts of things, for employment, for global, European supply chain, for traveling and being able, to work in the UK. I mean, all sorts of things could become apparent as a result of this first example of an exit from the EU. So in a way, I don't know what the impact would be, nobody knows on European elections, but I think this could somewhat scare off some countries from trying a similar experiment. This is all up in the air, of course, still, but that would be as close as to a counterfactual as I can imagine.
Yes, so that's the optimistic view on the Brexit experiment. Both of us were in right. And indeed, I mean, there is, there's a view of a world in which, in some countries, institutions are strong enough to resist for such an experiment, and this can be a path and an example, the lesson for the others. There's also a possibility that when we go through this very bad experiment, it corrupts the entire institutional setup, and really we end up in a bad place. So we don't really know. But what I wanted to say is more like, I think what we are struggling with, and it was the same thing with the first panel, is that we are, in essence, we are trying to be rational, to bring data, to bring evidence. We have done that all our lives. And we struggle when we don't understand why people are not convinced, right? I mean, the whole Brexit debate, in a way, has been a lot about that. What I think we need a lot more research about that. What we don't fully grasp is what makes people click. There was this documentary about Brexit that was aired for the first time a few days ago. Some of you might have seen it, which was showing how one of the Brexit campaign was literally thinking about their message. It's almost like, I would call that propaganda, in the sense of identifying a very limited number of key issues, which in their case was, migration and giving money to the NHS, and how they constructed their entire message on these very simple two key messages that were hammered and hammered and hammered again into the public opinion. So this is not, scientific evidence. Actually, the two messages were based on literally wrong facts. They were, both of them, based on lies, but it turned out to be extremely efficient, right? So I think this is something, I meant effective. This is something that I think we don't fully understand, that we don't, on our side, I mean, in terms of Europe, if we had to think about what are the positive messages, etc., we would have to think also a little bit more on those terms, maybe, but we hate doing that because what we like bringing to the table is, more exhaustive things, more data, more facts, etc. And however, we seem to have failed to a large extent. So that's the question. How do we deal with that? I don't think we know at this stage.
Okay, now there are three more questions. Wow. Okay, please make it short questions, and then we will have short answers.
So that's too bad for the short question, because I thought I would have the opportunity to do a very short self-promotion about a proposal that you may be aware of that has been made in last December by a group of economists and political scientists. Among the economists, Thomas Piketty and myself, so members of the CEPR. And we had a very similar diagnosis that Europe probably needs to provide collective public goods that cannot be provided at the national level anymore, including fight against the climate change, migration, and inequality. And the two solutions we came up with that we don't have currently in Europe is we have a very small budget, and this budget is made of individual contribution, national contribution, which actually triggers the behavior as Brexit, like that's what I give and that's what I bring, that's what I get, and so I don't think it's fair, as a citizen. So our proposal is to build up a budget which is sizable, 4% of GDP, and based on own resources instead of individual contribution. And among the own resources that we proposed were corporate tax. One of the solutions to try and address the tax evasion that André, for example, said that we're a champion in tax evasion. So we need to address that, which is actually one of the main criticisms that the citizen made about Europe. So this first proposal is, this first thing is a sizable budget. And what do you need to have a sizable budget? You need the parliament to vote and to make the final decision. So that's the two pillars of our proposals, a budget and a secondary parliamentary chamber who would have the final say on a common budget. So that's it, self-promotion. I'd like to know whether you heard of it, because we have a website, already lots of signatories, and if you have any reaction on this.
Okay, thank you. And we'll collect the other, if there are still hands. Can we have, yeah, go.
Just a question, you keep on repeating we should spread more news, better news. Who is we? This is my question.
So when I was talking about we, I was talking about us here in the front.
So what is the recommendation? Who should spread more and better news?
Okay, I see.
What should be done?
Okay.
One point which has not been raised very clearly is the fact we're talking about the past and about what is happening. But one issue which doesn't seem to be addressed in this discussion and is the question of security in terms of economic security. Now, if people don't feel secure at home, it doesn't help to say that in the past it was colder or outside is colder, like Brexit. So we need to deal with the problem of the construction we have. And the managers of the house at the moment are perceived as being unable to deal with the problem. Now, I think also from the discussion in economic terms, I think we are often looking at the symptoms of the problems, and we are missing a number of areas where, let's say, particularly an area where I think it actually would be good to look at it from a general economic equilibrium, but in fact there is nobody really looking at it from this perspective, but it affects many, many areas. And it's one element in the construction of the euro which has never been addressed properly. And I fear a little bit that there's been a bit of tendency of the economic, let's say, world to not to enter in this area, which is the area of the integration of the bond market in Europe. And the function of this, or actually the misfunction of this, is probably the origin of many of the problems, and is making people feeling insecure. And going forward, people feel also insecure because Europe is actually shrinking in a global level. It's shrinking in economic terms, it's shrinking in political terms. So the point is that are we looking from this perspective, are we looking to make Europe, whatever Europe will be, let's say, left better and stronger, or just you're trying to fix the problems in the past? I think that's one issue which probably needs to be done. And then since I'm from ECFIN, and you made the point before, I think was made, I think it would be very, very helpful to have exchanges with you from CEPR. I would also recommend not just to go only to the top levels of the Commission. You probably at your level, the more senior people, yes, you should do it, but I think at the lower level, let's say I'm a head of unit, and I think there are some others here, I think we'll be very, very pleased to meet in particular the other people which make CEPR to discuss on this question. I think we have the questions which we face when we talk to politicians and we talk to member states on this. We might have some answers, but we'll be very glad to have your own views, so that we can build our answers. So you're very welcome, I was saying. My door is always open. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that.
Thank you. There is a clear feeling of gloom around the table. People are very sad, very worried. Hélène says it's maybe survival. I think you have to look a little bit further than the borders of Europe. We have globally a wave of populism. The US, friends from Brazil can tell you what it means. That's happening everywhere, and in Europe, what goes with populism is nationalism. So in Europe, it takes a particular slant, which is against Europe, because that's what nationalism has historically been. But you have to realize that it's not a European problem. So when you start thinking of all the problems and start wringing your hands saying it's terrible what we are doing in Europe, I'm not saying it's not good. It's good, but you have to be careful. We know globalization, past technological change, blah, blah, blah. Now, when you look at the data, if you look at the usual Eurobarometer data and trust in European institutions, it went down, the trust went down after 2008-9 with the global crisis, and it went further down with the Eurozone crisis. And then now it's coming back, it's not yet up where it was. Now this is just one instance of the well-researched literature on the impact of financial crisis, on populism and nationalism and all of that. So that's what is happening. Crisis hurt, and in Europe we had two. We had the global one and we had our own. So instead of wringing your hands and trying to invent clever schemes, I suggest that we think very hard what we can do to avoid another Eurozone crisis, because that's what hurts, and that's what is specific to us, not globalization and so on and so forth. What is specific is crisis. And if a crisis, we cannot do that with a probability of 100 of avoiding a crisis. If one happens, we are able to manage it better than last time. And if we do that, I think that's about the best we can hope to do. We are not going to change technological change and so all of these things, but we're going to bring back trust where it was before in the good old times.
So I'm starting to get the feeling, I would like to have the concilium in here. We close the doors and nobody is getting out of here because this is picking up. Matthias, you're the last one. And you want to speak now? Okay, and then Richard.
Yes, indeed it's been a bit gloomy, but at the same time, I guess the situation is not that rosy. This being said, I wanted to stress one thing. The title Economic Challenges for Europe, and of course in CEPR there is economics. Now the question is, to what extent can economists contribute just by doing economics? And I know we do a type of economics that is reasonably broad with political economics and so on. This being said, I think all these problems seem to go beyond just Europe. There is a general lack of trust in the world, in the developed world at least, about indeed multilateralism, elites, both international and national, experts, the media. political parties, trade unions, everything. So there seemed to be a kind of increasing desperation, and the families is not doing too well in general, and so people are becoming lost, and I think the fact that racism comes into the picture in democracies is quite natural, because foreigners don't vote, so it's kind of easy to offer these kinds of solutions. But all these things, they go beyond economics. And so one question is, I know economists typically like to think they are better than other social scientists. Not everybody, of course, but I like the fact that in Piketty's book he said, look, economics is not better because it's more mathematical, of course. It's not the only way to be rigorous. Economics is different because it is trying to improve the world. Now, I think we should team up with other disciplines and tell them about all ways to think about it. I think, for example, in econometrics we are ahead of many, but I think now with data being available everywhere, isn't it a right moment to push for a big interdisciplinary effort to try and improve these challenges that I think go much deeper than purely the failures that do exist, of course, in European integration?
Yes, in a sense responding to what Laurence Moon said, but more broadly, the Brexit word was finally brought in. And I think I would say there are two messages that I would take from what we have been experiencing. One is my own personal experience of trying to talk to non-technical audiences about this. You simply cannot rest upon technical arguments. You cannot rest upon economics, really. Eyes glaze over, they don't understand, they will not understand, however simply you explain it, okay? It just won't work. And so, what do I conclude from that? You have to have a positive message, and this is, of course, what the Remain campaign lacked. They were looking back, in a sense. They were saying, oh, how things could be worse if we leave. That's a backward-looking perspective. And what I would like to ask a panel, just to conclude very quickly, what we need is to project a vision and values. And if you had if you could say it, what would be for each of you the most positive thing you could say about why, where Europe should be going, how it should be going? What is the vision, right? And what are the values underlying it? That's what I think we have to sell. There's not much time to do it, by the way, but I think that's where it's at.
Thank you very much for all of those comments. And since we are quickly running out of time, actually have almost run out, I will ask for very short reactions from our panelists. And let me, however, say also, the one with the vision, what is your vision? As I said initially, was asked of every single politician yesterday in that room, and some just evaded the questions, and another particular one spoke for 20 minutes. That's also not really what a vision should look like. It should be, something that you can actually say in an elevator. So, André, your elevator speech for Europe.
Okay. First, I say I agree 100% with what you said, Richard. I think that's where it's at. We need to project something positive. We need a project. So, what project? I think that one of the strengths of Europe, of European countries, and Micael said that, I think is still the element of equity. We are equitable, fairly equitable societies, although that has been worsening a bit. But I think this is a strength, and this is definitely something that makes us apart from other parts of the world. And certainly from the other two giants, the United States and China. And I think that is very, very important. The element of diversity, I think very important. I think the notion of innovation, we should be more innovative, but innovation, I think, is something that is also a positive value. And I think that linked to that, all the issues about climate, energy, I think fits very, very well. I think it's a challenge that speaks to people, speaks to a lot of young people. So innovative solutions to deal with climate, but to do that in an equitable manner. I think around that, that's what I would build as a narrative to project into the future.
Again, tough, huh? But so elevator speech. Europe is the region in the world in which most citizens live well. And what does it mean well? Well, that means these values of liberal democracies to which I was alluding to, right? The core values, which have to do with liberty, security, fairness, that's another way of saying equitable, and also respectful of our environment, which is the planet. And that's it, right? And if, the EU could come up with much more visible ways in which dealing with fairness, which is right now, I think, a big issue. It's a global issue, so that's why, Charles, I don't think we disagree. I think the shocks have been largely global. The financial crisis has been a global shock. We don't want to go the full cycle from financial to economic to social to political crisis to war, as has happened before, right? So we want to stop before. But the shocks have been common to a number of countries, and there's definitely an issue with fairness, which links back to much more mundane things that we talked about before, about money laundering, about tax evasion, about tax optimization, about people not paying their fair share of public good, and therefore public goods having been cut, partly also because of the crisis, in a number of places, and that also played a role in Brexit. In fact, some papers show that the vote to Brexit has also been linked to the cut in local public goods, for example. So I think the simple message of the EU is a place where most citizens can live well, and that's actually a rare thing in the world, would be a good one.
Thank you. I think a vision is important, definitely. But what people want is answers to their very concrete concerns. And what they are concerned about is, will my pension be paid when I retire? Will my deposits be safe when there is a financial crisis? Will my children have a better life than I do today? These are the issues, I think, that people worry about. And so we need to come up with a vision, yes, but also with concrete answers to these questions. And if I were to put it in a slogan, I would say two things: a Europe that protects and a Europe that empowers. The only person in Europe that I'm aware of today who conveys this positive European agenda is President Macron. He has a vision. And my impression is he's one of the very few with a vision out there that is a positive vision. And basically he says that in a globalized world like the one we are experiencing today, sovereignty can only be achieved at the European level. And many of the answers to the concerns that people are facing can only be, the answer to these concerns can only be found at the European level. As I said, this financial stability, deposit stability, the security of jobs, pensions. These are what people worry about. So you need a vision, yes, but you need concrete answers to these concrete questions. And I think there is a vision out there. There is a vision out there that is the one conveyed by the President of France, but is one of the very few promoting this vision.
as Hélène was saying earlier, we don't like, as economists, to have slogans. No? So I'm a bit uncomfortable. What's your vision? Like, it seems like propaganda, but okay. But it is. And I'm really not good at it, and I don't like it. But I wish for my daughters, I have 2 daughters, that they have opportunities like I had, to go and study in other European countries, marry a foreigner, live abroad, be able to decide I'm going to study here and work there. I mean, this is a vision of Europe that I hope stays, to which we need to, add probably new challenges, new solutions to, new problems. But I think this vision of this mobility, it's a great vision. It's something that is unique because you have mobility across all these diverse countries, and this can lead to more ideas, better ideas, more productivity. We need to, I agree that there is this issue of equity and how to deal with redistribution. Here I want to go back to your proposal. You mentioned, I didn't know it, I'm going to look at it. It seemed very interesting. My concern, you said that you're going to raise funds for this redistribution to through the corporate taxes, but part of the problem is corporate taxes. Given the corporations are mobile internationally, okay, there is a major problem within Europe with Ireland and other paradises, Luxembourg, Belgium to some extent. But if you then go to a higher homogeneous corporate tax in Europe, then they're going to go elsewhere. So it's more than a European problem, and that's my response. But we can engage in a deeper debate about that.
So it's clearly not the kind of questions we are used to to answer. But if I had to try and have a snappy sentence, something like "make your voice heard, Father." You can yell with a high pitch in your room, but you will have no influence. Take back control. Control of what? And the pitch would be something where the elevator talk would be something that we need to build a Europe that adapts and responds to the needs of its citizens. We talked about that. That if we do things alone in our own corner, we'll just give power to those who are unified outside of Europe, and doing things together we need to make things together to become stronger.
As I was saying, this is becoming more and more interesting. I think there's a kind of little challenge that the panel had. Every single one in the room should sort of think of what would they have said if they had been asked to come up with a 1-2 sentence speech on Europe. I certainly can say that test, most people yesterday, as I said, failed it. Coming up, and maybe this is because we really have not only as economists, and your question, who is we? When I say we, then I'm partly talking about us here in front and economists more in general, but I'm also talking about CEPR in this case. What we also, as economists, also, as we speak through CEPR, we don't really have the language. We have kind of forgotten this language, this positive language of speaking about vision, of articulating what is it that we, in this case, are trying to project, and we have more like we have a feeling more than a language for it, and therefore we should maybe not be so surprised if we are not talking to the people who are not listening to us. So there is much more to be said, and maybe one thing is that certainly. I think you said, Richard, we should be using now, we as CEPR should be using more our communication and dissemination tools that we have, developing them towards reaching out to further audiences, and this is indeed one of the things that are very much on the top of the agenda. If anybody has, some funding for it out there, then that would certainly help a lot, because a lot of this communication these days is audiovisual and it's not written down, and this is not cheap either. I want to, before we close this, we actually have one last point on the agenda, which is virtual ribbon cutting. In today's world, we do not have an actual physical office to open. It is a intellectual, it's an intellectual and a virtual, but we do have a representative, a regional representative for CEPR. Where are you? Come to the front, please. With whom we are at least going to, shake hands here yet, and agree that this is the official opening of the CEPR office in Brussels. And I do give the mic to you, Bram, for a few words.
Thank you, Beatrice. To explain to all of you why I should be and why I am happy today to become, that ECARES becomes the first regional representative office, I have to go back to November 1991 and to use the same words as Matthias. At that time, a new baby was born at Université Libre de Bruxelles, since the Institute of European Studies and CEPR created a new research center called, not yet ECARES, but almost ECARES. And I looked up the mission of ECARES at that time, and I quote, ECARES wants to encourage high-quality research in economics with special emphasis on policy issues relevant to Western and Eastern Europe and to provide a meeting place for academics, professional economists and civil servants from the Commission. That's exactly what I read today in the vision of CEPR, so the influence of the parents was quite obvious. CEPR helped its child a lot, since if I talk to Philippe or André on what happened in the 90s with ECARES, they almost always refer to these famous lunch meetings that brought together academics and non-academics to talk about policy-relevant issues. And the opposite is also true, since ECARES was quite active in CEPR, and I can now announce to the whole world, I will put it on our website, that we host the most CEPR heroes in the world. So, ECARES and CEPR have a common history, but as all parents know, children have to go to a phase of puberty. So I have to admit that in the last decade, the original mission was, let's say, less salient. So, as director of ECARES, I am happy to renew our vows today and to say that we now formally commit to organize on a regular basis every year 3 to 4 events for academics, non-academics, talking about relevant issues for Europe.
Thank you very much. And before we close, we have one last hero that we need to celebrate today. As you have noticed, there have been founding fathers, several of those, but no lady hero so far. However, we have somebody who has really also dedicated the largest part of her life to CEPR. And I'd like to invite Tessa. Please come and get... Richard was going to say a few last words before we close here.
Right. Well, many of you will not be surprised that I demanded from Beatrice the opportunity to say the last word. What do you expect? And like José, interestingly, I'm a kind of accidental European. And like José, I'm a passionate European. And I've followed today's proceedings in that spirit. And I think it's been a very, very interesting afternoon. But what I really wanted to do, aside from saying that, and thank you for that, Beatrice and Tessa for organizing it, is to thank Beatrice and to wish her well going forward with the guidance and help of Charlie in pushing CEPR into new dimensions and new things. I think CEPR has been extraordinarily fortunate to get Beatrice as its new president, and you will have, I'm sure, from today's proceedings, all of you who didn't realize that will now do so. She's terrific, and she has absolutely the right values and the right qualities to push CEPR forward over the next several years. So, to Beatrice, my thanks, and best of luck.
Thank you so much.